All right, we are live on YouTube, which is nice. There's a latency of like 20 seconds here, so just going to make sure the sound's good. All right, we are live on YouTube, which is nice. There's a latency of like 20 seconds here, so just going to make sure the sound's good. All right, we are live on YouTube, which is nice. There's a latency of like 20 seconds here, so just going to make sure the sound. Okay, things look good. Let's get going with today's games. All right, we are live. So the first game we're going to look at is between Hikaru and somebody who's a little bit lower rated, but still extremely high in rating overall. And his name is Nana Karobi Yaoki, and his rating is 2,764. Very high rated, but compared to Hikaru, not that high. Our goal for today is to improve our ability at a few things. One, finding key ideas during the game, trying to take a look at what our opponent's playing and trying to find a key idea. We're going to obviously see how Hikaru finds these ideas to combat his opponent's play. We're going to try to anticipate what our opponent's going to do as well, anticipate Hikaru's moves. So if White's making a move quite quickly, especially at the start, let's try to think about how Hikaru is going to make moves, analyze them. The game is being played in real time from chess.com. I've downloaded them and using this system to replay the games in real time. All right, let's get going. So Hikaru plays b6, bishop e7 setups, e6 controlling d5, knight e2. Moves come in really fast at the start. It's very typical at this level. Pawn c3. Now things slow down a little bit. d5 challenge in the center, knight d7, pawn c5. Okay, bishop trade immediately. Queen c8 defending the knight. Moves coming in really fast. g6 stopping f5, pawn c5. I think very normal. First moment, White starts to slow down. And the light squared bishops have been traded, which favors Black because all of his pawns in the center are already on light squares. At the right moment, Black could take and use the c-file. Black goes for a queen trade, saying, hey, this endgame is favorable with the pawns again on light squares. The dark squared bishop for Black is very valuable. Okay, c4, I like this idea, but the center seems a bit loose, and Hikaru takes advantage of it tactically. You cannot take with the pawn because the rook on a1 hangs. Black is simply up a pawn already. You could take this pawn again. You could take on a3. I don't think he will, though. I think he'll... Okay, he plays h5, challenging the king side a bit, and wins another pawn. This is already a huge position. Okay, bishop to e7 maybe. Knight d5 is a move as well. Actually, I don't want to do knight d5 because I don't want to allow any sacrifices on e6. So queen b7. You could take that. Then bishop a3. Maybe he doesn't want to activate White's dark squared bishop. Bishop e7. Doesn't take. this dark squared bishop. Knight takes b5. Stopping bishop a3 as well. And knight f5. And now that knight f5 is on the board, black has absolutely no problems, and he's up 3 pawns here. It's already a winning position. Rook b8, getting out of any tricks with knight f6 check. You can start rolling the pawns. You can play a5 here. There's really nothing white can do. Rook h5 as well. Knight c5 going for some trades. This does allow knight d6. But now the queens are going to get traded. So you could just take and trade queens and go rook h7. You could trade queens and go knight e3 as well. Take, knight e3. Just goes rook h4, targeting the pawn. Attacking a weakness. Knight takes f7. And you can go back, knight c5. You could also take. You could also take too. Let's see what he does. Probably knight c5. But then knight e5. Okay, he goes for this, knight e3. Just keeping that option available. Knight takes. King takes. Okay, he's just down more material now. And saves the rook. You could even take that. It's so winning. Of course he doesn't, though. It doesn't give away material unnecessarily. Rook d8. Rook a7. Rook d7. Completely crushing. White resigns in this game. Alright, let's go to our game analysis. Should be a quick one. Won't spend too much time on this, as black was just completely dominating at a certain point once the pawn was lost. I think it's interesting how a 2700 rated player plays as well. They even if they are down material, he still put a lot of pressure on black. He still found ideas, and black did have to react precisely to defend. E4, b6, bishop e7, e6, knight f6, and d5. So white has a nice opening advantage. f4, bishop a6, and f4, top move by the engine, but now after bishop a6, not as big as an advantage as it initially said. Just a pawn and a bit. Takes, queen e2, queen c8, g6, and pawn c5. So as mentioned previously, with the pawns on light squares, black has gotten rid of his, let's say, bad bishop. Typically in this structure, the bishop on c8 is called bad because the pawns are on the same color as the bishop. So he trades off the light squared bishops with queen a6. Bishop a6. And now he wants to actually trade queens as well. This strategy is making it very difficult for white to find an active plan. White's active plan is pawn to f5 here, which was available a few moves ago, f5, but it would have been a pawn sacrifice, but maybe it's playable to weaken the d5 square and the f5 pawn potentially as well. So f5 was an option. Knight f3 was played, g6, and c5. a3. Best from the engine is h4, just launching the attack. But after h5, it's not really obvious how you're going to break through. G4 can't be played. Taking doesn't really feel good. You can take back and develop the bishop at the same time. But engine says white should go for this. Okay, a3, knight c7, going for queen a6, and white could have traded and gone into this endgame. I don't think black has any problems, but maybe this is what white should have done anyways. After c4, white blundered a pawn with pawn takes b4, and Hikaru takes advantage of it. There's a pin on this diagonal. There's a pin on this file, and the bishop does defend the pawn anyways. If the rook moves, you can take. G4, now white launches the attack. H5, this move is quite clever because if you try to play f5 here, it can be quite threatening. So after the move h5, f5 cannot be played at the moment because h takes, attacking the knight. And if you take on e6, you can take back with the knight here. And this break was not as powerful as what white would have hoped for. So h5, a reaction to g4, Hikaru plays h5. Knight g5, entering on the dark squares. This is a a lack of, let's say, advantage for black here, disadvantage. I don't know if it's a huge disadvantage, but the dark squares are a bit weak. But a disadvantage for black is he has committed h5, so you can't ever play h6, f6 as well. You don't want to play. Takes. Hikaru's up 2 pawns now. Knight gets some nice activity. This could be very scary. And queen b7 is played. Queen b7 is putting some pressure on the knight, also potentially getting the queen to d5 and not allowing any tricks maybe on this file. Queen centralizing, opening up the pawn. I'm trying to understand. I also thought about queen b7 in the game, but why is it so effective? Because you could do bishop e7 as well. Bishop e7, bishop b2, pawn c3, but now pawn takes, attacking the queen. So queen b7, okay. Not actually the best move here. Best move is b5, just cementing this pawn chain. Queen b7 takes, bishop e7. This is what I thought. I don't think he's going to take, which is a huge mistake because after bishop a3, the dark squares are really weak. If you take, the knight's coming into d6 no matter what. Even if queen moves, knight's coming into d6, and white has a very strong position now. The king being ripped apart. King e7, knight takes on f7. Queen takes. Probably not queen takes because of rook g8. Okay, bishop e7. White does get a pawn back and tries to fix this structure, but it's also just a blunder. Knight takes, knight f5. One trick in the position, threatening knight f6. Hikaru sees it, rook b8, and there's no hope for white in this position. So let's go to our analysis page and try to understand why white lost this game so quickly. The opening was Hikaru played some b6, bishop b7, knight f6, and d5 setup. Okay, main reason for win. Black successfully won a pawn and converted his material advantage while minimizing opponents' attacking chances. Main reason for loss, white blundered pawn, which maybe wasn't the end of the world, but it was a really bad pawn in the position to lose. It just activated black's pieces on the queen side and black's pawns on the queen side as well, when he could have gone into the endgame. Okay, additionally, I think let's add some notes here. White didn't manage to get a good position out of the opening in terms of plans. He could have played more aggressively to start with, like pawn to f5, just pawn f5. Kind of very difficult to say what could have been done in the opening. Maybe let's turn on the engine here. Knight f3 could be played. This looks absolutely fine though, like white's just fine. e5, knight d7, f4, everything looks very natural here. And bishop takes. So knight to f3 as well, slightly better. Then this keeps the knight on b8 at bay, rather than taking, and the knight was able to support the c5 advance, which is still fine actually. Bishop takes is fine. Computer says knight f3 is better. The knight's slightly underdeveloped. So one key is not helping the opponent develop, even though in this case the knight is sidelined. It supported the c5 advance. Let's see what happened to this knight. It went back to c7 anyway, so it found a nice way to reroute, controlling this e6 square, which was actually very important in this position, that white cannot take on e6 because the knight defends. All right, let's take a look at game number 2. All right, how are you guys enjoying the stream so far? This is the first time we're on YouTube. I'm not sure if people do so much gaming on YouTube or streaming on YouTube, but I thought it'd be interesting to do a live stream on YouTube. All right, let's take a look at the next game. Hikaru with white, Nana Karobi as black. We have a Sicilian with c3, and black immediately plays e5. Against this, bishop c4, assuming pawn to e3, bishop to e7, castles, bishop g5, d6. Yeah, very natural moves. Okay, rook e1, if b5, bishop b3. Okay, now how does he react to this? I'm curious. He just ignores it and goes knight f1. I think black's fine out of the opening. White has a slight edge, but is doing fine. He trades his dark squared bishop for the knight to dominate the d5 square. So black needs to find a plan here. He goes b5. Looks fine. Knight e7 is a move. See what he decides. Goes rook c8. a4, undermining the structure. You could have left the pawn there. Now c4 is weak. This also looks okay though. h3. attacking the weakness. Pawn to a5. The b5 square is a bit weak, but shouldn't be that big of a deal here. Now Hikaru's thinking. The bishop on g5 does a good job covering the d2, c1 squares. What do you think White's plan is here? Hikaru goes g4, controlling the f5 square further, stopping black from playing f5. Takes, should take with a bishop. Drop the bishop back. Now the f4 square is a bit weak. And it looks like black is doing well. He's going to jump his knight to f4. Bishop on c4 covers some light squares, but doesn't have a target. Now, okay, what to do? This black, he's slowing down a bit. I think queen e8 makes sense. Does white want to go d4, though? Probably not. Okay, takes on b4. You could play a5, a6. Black doesn't seem to have the attack I think he's looking for here, even though his knight's very well placed. So he goes for this attack. Maybe it's the only chance, but it seems a bit weakening. Black is okay. I find this move quite interesting. Pawn a7, just advancing the pawns. It's actually typical of what Hikaru does. He advances the pawn even further than what you might expect. The bishop was defending it on a6, cemented, and Hikaru just launches it one step forwards. Now he goes for this, which is surprising as well, because knight could take, and after pawn takes back, he evaluates this as favorable for white, but okay, if you take the knight h2, a very nice move, I think. You still have knight h2 if needed. You could, actually, you can't take now, I don't think. What's he going to play? Is he going to queen? Then queen takes g4, just... Okay, wow, queen takes g4 can be played here. Rook takes g4 as well, but queen takes g4, king h2. Okay, Hikaru's up a lot of material now. You could trade the queen for the rook and move the knight. Takes like this. Interesting decision. Take. And now you can move the knight to safety. Why not just take the knight with a check? Hikaru just sacks the knight anyways, just gives away material to simplify the position. And here, black just resigns the game. All right, let's go to our game analysis. Quite an interesting game. I think there was some key moments that we'll take a look at. So, Hikaru with black pieces this time. Hikaru with white pieces this time. e4, c5, knight c6, and c3. He plays for this Alapin approach with c3 playing for d4. Black stops it with e5. Bishop c4, knight f6, d3, bishop e7. And very common setup. Against this bishop trade, he plays knight f1. He doesn't take, which would give black the f-file and maybe some play. At some point, maybe black goes for d5. I don't think he could without weakening the e5 pawn. The knight would hit it, but maybe his idea could be queen e8, queen g6. And still comfortable position for both sides, very complex. Okay, knight f1, and here if black takes, white would take back, and the d6 pawn can be a target. You can play queen d2, maybe queen d3, rook d1, takes, and queen takes is an idea. The d5 square and f5 square are quite weak, and it's actually very difficult to get rid of this weakness now with b5. Maybe b5 is stopped, but maybe b5 can be played as well. This is also playable. h6 trades, and gets a scenario where Hikaru's hoping for good bishop versus bad knight. A4, B4, H3, bishop G5, and knight D5. King H8 is the idea to play for F5. Hikaru plays bishop C4, targeting a weakness. Pawn to A5 is played. And this is a key moment. Hikaru plays pawn G4. This move stops Black's play with pawn to F5, but it weakens the F4 square permanently, and the engine disagrees with it. Queen to E2 was the best move. Not exactly sure what the plan is with Queen E2, but it doesn't create some weaknesses. So quite surprising that he weakens the F4 square, but also stops Black's main pawn advance. So after Queen E2, let's say pawn to F5. It doesn't work because there's a tactic, actually. Knight takes B4. The bishop is hanging. If bishop takes, not pawn takes bishop, but knight C6 first, attacking the queen. You can take on C6. If bishop takes on D3, knight takes the queen and comes to E6 at the end. Actually, knight takes G5 is better first, so the bishop can't take. White's just much better there. So maybe Queen E2, F5, sorry, Queen E2, F5 wasn't the biggest threat because of knight to B4, which was missed. So he stops his opponent's plan, but gets a worse position. Bishop takes, knight E7. I think Black did really well here. King G2 and King G3. This is also quite a surprising move. Advancing the king towards the black pieces to control the H3 pawn and cover some squares on H4. If you just go King H2, for example, you cover H3, but you don't cover this H4 square. So king goes all the way to G3 here, and black is better. Takes, Hikaru starts advancing, and best move here, which is terribly difficult to play, is pawn D5. What's the point? I think if you take this way, I thought D5 might be a move here, but the computer just says G6. Open up lines to the king. If pawn takes, now D5, bishop moves, let's say, and bishop D6 is the idea. So D5 is the pathway to get to this diagonal with the bishop. And black is doing really well now. If knight takes would be disastrous. This line is opening up further. Queen to F6. This knight is hanging. Queen D2. And you could just win a free knight here. So black missed this idea. And it appears that the pawn F5 move cannot be played here because white clamps down. He can take with the G pawn. He can take with the E pawn. And it looks like just a blunder. So let's see. White can take this way. And now the F5 pawn is going to be undermined with this move D5. If you take, then the F5 pawn becomes weak, which is no good. And if you take with the bishop, then knight takes undermines the F5 pawn again, and black gets to play. And if you move the bishop to safety, then this diagonal opens up just a little bit here. Actually, not too much, but it does open up a little bit. Pawn C4 could be a threat. If pawn A6, then C4 is a strong move, undermining this F5 pawn. So this was an opportunity for black to find actually a very, very difficult move. And you have to see that G6 can be played here, and that if takes, D5 can be played here. It's a really tough move to find, sacking the pawn. But the idea is concretely trying to open up lines to the white king. Okay, black went G6, which is still a fine move, preparing to play F5. So this is not a bad move at all, just preparing F5. A6, F5, A7, and black goes a bit wrong here with H5. Better was just taking, and blocking the pawn. I wonder about d5 to do this idea now, instead of blocking the pawn, but it doesn't work at all apparently, because if bishop takes, and if knight takes, pawn takes, let's say queen takes, you have queen to e2 and queen to e4 with knight to e5. Very complex position. But the passed pawn on a7 is quite strong, and this e pawn is quite weak. This pawn isn't going anywhere, and the queen does protect the knight on f3. So white is doing really well there. h5, still not a big deal. Bishop d5 is played, which is an error here. Hikaru could have captured on f5. You really don't want to make this move, because if captures back, the king is wide open on the g file. The best move is sliding the king to h2. The g8 square is actually covered by this bishop, which is critical. So white could have gone for this, and then maybe play queen d2 and queen e4. Maybe, but I don't think he wants to, because d5 can be played there. So maybe just rook g8, rook g1, potentially. Okay, bishop d5 is played, knight takes, pawn takes, takes, and queen d7 here. Completely level position. Black does have counterplay on the f-file. White finds the only move in the position, rook to e4 and rook to f4, is a blunder, but really not obvious. He could have taken maybe some time to stop the pawn from advancing first. And this was absolutely fine. He allowed way too much counterplay looking for the win. And if, by the way, it looks really difficult to find the defensive move here. I thought as well, taking during the game is not as good, because I thought knight h2, which apparently is a mistake because of bishop h4 and rook f2, and black does get the counterplay he's looking for. So in this case, rook h1 check first, king g7, and knight d2, and the bishop check is not possible. Okay, so queen d7 played, rook e4, rook f4, and he gets a queen. I thought queen g4 was a good try here, but after king h2, there's nothing. You have rook takes, but now queen can take on c8, which I just think is the simplest, and take on f3. Engine says just take the queen, which also is really, really strong. Pawn takes, queen takes, king h2. The problem is the rook's hanging. If you take, king g7, and there's no checks. You can take on f3, but you lose the queen here. If you trade queens, you lose the bishop, and there's nothing black can do here. Really deep complications, but what I find fascinating about this game is Hikaru advanced the pawn to a7. Typically, you would think that the pawn would be held on a6. The bishop defends it nicely. If you push it further, then the pawn is on a very weak square. But the timing of the position allowed Hikaru to play pawn to a7, which I think is the reason he won the game. And rook f4 is a blunder. Really not an obvious blunder at all. It looks like visually the king is being demolished, but the king somehow just safely stays on the h2 square. All right, let's go to our analysis. Hikaru with let's just copy and paste this and put it here. The white pieces opening was some Spanish opening. Could be Spanish or Italian. I actually forget, but it's getting this same kind of structure. Let's change the font as well. So bishop c4, e4, d3, and he went for knight f1 idea, and he also played h3 as well. Okay, main reason for win. Hikaru's passed pawn on the A file was decisive. And tactically, this pawn won him the game. Main reason for loss from the opponent's side is, yes, there was extremely difficult complications, but black didn't stop white's main threat of advancing his pass pawn. As well, okay, black didn't calculate deep enough to find the mate or a concrete way to win material. And maybe he just played queen d7, queen takes g4 with the idea that he thought it was just winning without actually calculating it. Okay, notes. Black was better at several points in the game. He had f5 pawn sacrifice with g6 or d5, but missed it. But that was okay even. And Hikaru played g4, stopping white's play, stopping black's play on the king side temporarily. But I think black did really well. So black had the advantage, but didn't prevent the counterplay. White's counterplay. And the tactics favored white with the king and knight covering some important squares. Really complicated tactics. All right, let's take a look at game number 3. Hikaru with the black pieces. We get again same setup with b6, bishop e7. Same concept again. Will white change it? He doesn't. He goes e5. The structure is now fixed. He again trades on a6 rather than bringing the knight on d2 to f3. h4 is met with h5. There's no f5 pawn break at the moment. I already have a feeling this is going to go really well for black because white couldn't find the plan previously. So maybe he won't find it now. It's a little bit different than before. Queen was on e2. In this case, black hasn't gone knight a6 to d7. Again, white plays this a3 move. I think white's fine, but I also think black is more comfortable with this light squared bishop traded. He goes b4. So how does Hikaru deal with this? He takes once, and he's going to probably play rook c8 here, hitting the c3 pawn. So there's a pawn majority on the queen side for white, but it doesn't seem very effective. You can play knight g6 here. You can play knight c7. You can play knight b8. You can play g6. He goes for this knight trade. What could white do here? Maybe queen d3. But then knight g6 maybe. Knight g5? No, knight takes e5. So castles looks like a move as well. He does. Knight g6 hits the h4 pawn and the e5 pawn. He just goes knight c6, just saying, hey, I want to trade. I have a better pawn structure. Okay, knight e4. Repeat. You're the lower rated player. Repeat here, knight e4. But then maybe Hikaru sees knight g6. Rook c1 makes sense. Knight f5. b5 controlling the rook on a1, not opening it up. If knight d4, I guess you take, and queen has to take, and bishop e7 or rook c4. So this structure is very comfortable for black to play. The c4 square is weak. The e5 pawn's a bit weak. You could take that and go rook c4. You could take it anyways. You could take the pawn anyways, and bishop can take on b4. Black is up a pawn. Queen b3, just bishop e7. Yes, it's easy to say it when Hikaru is the one playing. I get that. Okay, that's an interesting move. So you can play queen e7 works. Just bishop e7. Okay, g6 makes sense. Castles make sense. The a5 pawn is weak. Bishop on b2 is bad. He takes, and now black has two connected pass pawns. You probably could take the pawn, but he doesn't. He just goes g6. Pawn on d4 still weak. You can go bishop d8, hitting the a5 pawn. You can go queen d5. Queen d5 just makes sense. b4 also makes sense. Okay. Just crushing, and yeah, just game over here. Take. Resigns the game. Not surprised, just resigns the game. So strategically, this is a very interesting setup that Hikaru is playing, and his opponent's not getting good counterplay in these structures. It makes you think, should you play this as black? Let's turn on the bar as well. Bishop d3, d5, e5. Bishop a6 takes. This is fine. I thought last time that trading helps black a little bit, so maybe knight f3, and so that the point is that if black takes, the queen develops. Doesn't make that big of a difference, but it is a subtle difference. The problem here is you want to play f4, f5, and the knight on f3 blocks it as well. So black seems fine there. But white does have a nice advantage. Small advantage, but it is an advantage. h4 also an advantage here for white. Pawn c3, queen d7, knight f3, pawn c5, a3, and half a pawn advantage. b4. Best idea here for white is knight f1. And I think, let's see, rook c8, knight g3, putting some pressure, queen b5. Let's just say what could he do? Let's say he reroutes the knight, same idea he did in the game. Knight g5, knight on b to c6, bishop to e3, g6, and a very difficult structure for white to break through. The knight on g3 also stops g4. It's very difficult to play f5 here. What about... yeah, c4 I really don't like here. So he goes for b4, just an equal position. Knight takes d4, rook c8, bishop e2. And black is better now. Better structure. Pawn is weak. Can't push c4. Pawn is weak. So we need to kind of really change something here as white. What to change though? c3, let's say d5. You haven't committed the bishop yet. e5, c5, bishop t3 now. Bishop a6 loses to a trick, takes, queen a4. You can't play bishop a6 yet, but queen d7 first. Knight to e2. Knight to e2 is critical. Playing for f4, bishop a6. And bishop c2. Keeping the light squared bishop alive. Castles f4, rook f2, maybe knight g3. Maybe g4, knight g3. That's a nice idea to remember not trading off this bishop and keeping the bishop alive on this diagonal. I have to say this does give black a tremendous diagonal himself with the bishop as well. Maybe this was the way to go. Difficult decision to make. And the computer even likes knight takes d4, and you can't castle so easily here, so maybe the king will manually castle. Let's see the line. Queen c7, knight to f3, knight to e7, bishop f4, knight to c6, rook to c1, bishop to e7, pawn to h4. Let's say you react in the same manner with h5. Now bishop to a4. So the king not getting castled here, keeping the bishop alive is a critical way to play. King f8. And now he trades bishop voluntarily. So the engine is playing for a completely different type of game here. Now that the king has committed himself to f8, he's saying it's okay to trade if takes. Takes also, I don't think 100% necessary, but... And c4, breaking on the light squares. And you can't play like knight d5 or queen d5. The pawn on d5 will be weakened quite significantly. Check. King f1 can be played, just bishop d2. White has the edge. So I guess this analysis I'm just doing, but the point that might be an interesting idea for white is avoiding the trade of light squared bishops with bishop c2. And the reason is in this position, the knight gets to c7, and whenever you play pawn c4, you can take and install the knight on d5. And in the other cases, the knight was not able to be installed on d5 so easily. Okay, white's completely fine here as well. Nothing wrong with this. But this is such an easy and comfortable position to play now for black. Knight f5, b5, and you could just take this. Queen takes, you have rook c4. So just winning a pawn here, bishop e7. And if we look at this, not the next game, because Hikaru will be white, but the game afterwards, if we see the same line, I'm going to make some anticipation that this same kind of idea will happen and black will get a comfortable game again. Okay, this is already a completely winning position. This is a huge blunder. Now you can take and get two connected pass pawns on the queen side. All right, let's go to our analysis. Game number 3, same as game number 1. Hikaru is achieving a successfully strategic idea in the opening and is picking up material, pawn advantage, and winning the game quite comfortably. Main reason for loss is white is not clearly finding the best setup against black's choice. Better was bishop c2. At least I found bishop c2. Like, maybe there's other ways, of course, better, but at least better was bishop c2. And not allowing the knight from a6 to c7 to control d5, which makes it very difficult for white to play c4, which is what he wants to play. Okay, and notes. This opening choice is quite clever for black if white doesn't have a strong way to proceed. Also, h4 is always met with h5. The g5 square is quite weak. And the knight g5 idea might be useful, but not that useful here. So just some notes here, just myself. Let's change the name of the sheet here. It's January 30th, 2024. All right, let's do the next game. Game number 4. Hikaru is white. Let's see if he goes for e4 again. How are you guys enjoying this stream so far? Are you learning something? As your internet chess coach, I hope that you're learning some ideas that you can play in your own games. And just watching these games, thinking about these games, seeing the ideas is going to improve your overall ability. So let's go to the next one. Black switches it. He plays the French. Hikaru plays knight d2. Queen d7. And castles queenside. Hikaru goes b4. Immediately launching pawn storm on the queen side. Now that black's castled there, which also means white will likely castle on the king side himself. Bishop e2 makes sense. Castles make sense. Queen e2 makes sense. He goes bishop e2. Knight h6 could be played. h5 can be played. g5 I don't like as much. h5 he goes for it. Hikaru goes b5. Now knight a5 would lock the queen side down here, but the knight would be out of the game. But I think it would be difficult to attack after knight a5, so I'd be curious to see what happens after knight a5, which happens in the game. Pawn c3. You could play knight b3 now. Bishop has to move. Knight to b3, challenging the knight, and that would allow the pawn to a5. I don't think he'll go for it now because the knight is sidelined, and you could just... Okay, I thought castles. He plays e5. All of these moves are quite surprising. Like e5 is very surprising. Just not on my radar. g5. Chaotic position now. You take on f6. You can play h4. You can play h3. You can play queen e2. You can play d4. Don't think he'll play d4. He'll keep the option of playing d4 later, maybe. Taking also makes sense. And taking the pawn makes sense. Okay, now he goes d4, controlling the e5 square a bit more. You can take on g5 and play h4, which seems like a good way to play it. Pawn e5 makes a lot of sense here, trying to open up the position. h4 makes sense. So these moves I'm sharing that make sense, to me at least. These guys are calculating it deeper, and while I can share the move and the idea is important, it's also critical to not just find the move, but calculate deeper as well. So he takes, Hikaru's up a pawn. The knight on g5 is loose. e5 gets serious counterplay. Bishop g2, take, but then bishop h3 was a threat. You cannot take. You found this so fast. If rook e8, then e6. Oh, okay, he just takes it, taking advantage of the pin. Hikaru's up a pawn, but king is unsafe. This looks very tactical, very interesting. You could play knight c4 at the right moment. Rook to e1 makes sense. Queen gets out of the pin. Bishop h3 coming. Queen g4 is an idea. Goes knight g4. Also looks reasonable. Okay, what would you play here as white? Very complicated position. He brings his last piece into the game. Rook to e1. He has 2 passed pawns on the king side, but his king is there, so you can't push them until the queens are off the board, in my estimation. Attacking f2, very reasonable. You could play knight f3 here. You could play f4, even though I don't think you want to weaken the king too much. Knight f3. then it kind of stuck as white. This might be the game that his opponent finds a way to win. Knight f3, knight c4. He's calculating his opponent's reply and counterattacks. He's putting on the pressure. The c3 pawn is hanging. I like black's position a lot here. But he blunders a one move. Knight to e6. A knight to e6 one move blunder. And he finds some play, but not good enough here. He saves the knight as well. Knight takes e5. It's just game over. Sudden win. Black resigns the game. Let's go to our analysis. Alright, game number 4. Hikaru is white. I do estimate black had some advantage at some point with a king on f1, knight on f3. He couldn't find the win, so this French defense is a better opening choice. Actually, the opening choice last time wasn't so bad either, but he does change it up. Queen d7, a3, and b4. White is slightly better here. Very complex position. b5. So b5 was an error by white. And it challenges the knight, but it gives this knight this opportunity to lock down the position on the queen side. And it becomes extremely difficult for white to break open. And I was really curious what Hikaru does here. Maybe a better move that you could consider is c3, protecting the b4 pawn, followed by a4, a5, opening up the position. Queen to e2 as well, and white does have a nice advantage here, but it's kind of difficult to see how you're going to open up the queen side. Maybe the idea is pawn c4 and pawn c5, and launching the c pawn this way, and if you take, the rooks come to the c file. h5, b5, knight a5, and a4. Black is better out of the opening. Better here was to take, open up some lines towards the king, but I think bishop e4 is fine. c3. And Hikaru now prevents black from taking and opening up the center. Still completely equal position now. Everything is fine. For black, we just get a very complicated position. Takes, d4, bishop d6, and knight wins a pawn, but black does have the advantage after h4. So white's king is going to get kind of ripped apart here. And Hikaru goes queen to e2, which is best move, and after takes, which is a mistake. Better was first consolidating the position a little bit. King to b8, maybe overprotect the e-pawn, or at the right moment the bishop could be useful in this diagonal. I thought the bishop was also useful here, so maybe that's not the right, maybe not the right approach. But king b8, maybe just rook g8. Engine line, by the way, goes f4, rook e8, and white queen side castles, which is not something easy to think about with the pawns pushed so far on the queen side. Okay, this is also completely fine. e5 gives a slight advantage for white after bishop g2, bishop h3, taking advantage of this. So king moves to safety now. Takes. If you take, you have rook to e8. Takes, king f1, sidestepping, and queen d3, sidestepping again. Knight g4, rook e1, and knight to f3. Best move here was just rook to e2. If you put the knight on f3, now the knight can't move. This was the problem. White's better here. And black's kind of stalled. You have queen g6 coming, invading into black's territory, trading queens potentially, and then using these two pass pawns on the king side. Knight to f3, knight to c4. Excellent move, bringing the knight in. As soon as this knight leaves control over c4, it gives black the opportunity to bring his knight into the game. Bishop c1, and a one move blunder in a complicated position. Black couldn't keep the tension. Bishop c1, just moving the bishop to safety. He could have played queen d6. And there's some potential sacrifice here. So let's say white goes knight to h7. You have the move knight f2, king takes, and bishop g3. And after bishop g1, line some massive amount of pressure up on the king. He missed this idea entirely, and his idea with queen g7 I thought was very clever at the time of the game because it goes after a weakness, which is the c3 pawn, but there's a bigger weakness in play, which is the white king here. And the key idea was queen d6. It's just completely different idea, going to rip open the white king. Very difficult to play, but very sharp and necessary. Okay, in the game, you're down so much material now. He goes for this tactic, just one move too late, and this doesn't need to be taken. He gives a check and moves the queen to safety, and you're just down a full rook for nothing. Now he sacrifices back material, a very nice decision, giving back some material to get a much more simplified position. All right, let's go to our Excel file, game number 4. Hikaru was white. Opening was a French defense. And black castles queenside. So white plays a3, b4, which I don't think was necessarily the best. Okay, main reason for win. Hikaru took advantage of a one move blunder and avoided any loss of material. Even though black did have a lot of pressure, he avoided any loss of material. Main reason for loss is a tactical blunder, but more than that, black played for the wrong weakness. He had to identify white's king as the weakness and sack the knight on f2 one move earlier. I think he played knight f2 as a desperation at that point. I don't think it was a serious attempt to destroy the king. Okay, note the knight on a5 did an excellent job of stopping white's play on the queen side. And pawn b5 was an error by Hikaru, which made it difficult for him to attack. Then again, his defensive skills and sharp tactical play won him the game. It was still super complicated. He took on e8, winning a rook, and also didn't take the knight on f2. He didn't play the most, like, what looks to be the most natural move. He was calculating fast and strong, and also simplified when in a winning position, giving back some material. He also played moves like king f1, just avoiding threats, just consistently avoiding tactical threats as they come. All right, last game for today. Game number 5. Hikaru with the black pieces. Let's see what setup he goes for. If white goes for that same e4 setup and get some sort of French structure, I anticipate black will do the same thing. So let's see if white changes the opening here or goes into this again. So e4, b6, same setup for black. He's going to go e6, d5, or e6. Same setup for white. So e6, d5. Okay, and now he changes something. It's going wrong for white, so he changes it. Now he goes bishop e4 and wins material. So this is quite nice for white. Black also has a grip on the position, but queen should be giving white the advantage here. So queen e2, bishop e7, pawn c4, I think, maybe castles, knight e5. This hangs g2. This hangs the pawn on g2. Could take and come back, and then a queen b5, bishop c8. Okay, so Hikaru gets a pawn back, and also the light scores are weaker now. But white should still be completely fine here. Completely different sort of game here. Black might struggle a lot in this game. This is the one. This is the game that we should really pay attention to now. How does black come from a bad position and win this? A strategically bad position. Let's count the material. So black has 7 pawns. White has 6 pawns. 4, 5, 6 pawns. We have 2 minor pieces for white. Black has 4 minor pieces. So that's an additional 6 points for black. But white has the queen. So 9 minus 6. White is up 3 points minus the pawn. White is up 2 points in terms of material. So his goal here is to trade, but maybe not necessarily. And the reason I say that is black's position is just very stable with the minor pieces, and if you trade too much, it'll be difficult to break even the queen versus like 2 minor pieces. Actually, queen versus 2 minor pieces should be quite playable. So he goes for a trade. Another trade makes sense. Just knight takes d7. d5. Nice idea. Ripping up black's king. And you have to go for the sack now, I think. Rook takes should be played. It gets really messy, but let's go for it. Rook takes. Okay, he doesn't. But now the e6 pawn is quite stable. Black's king is quite safe. You could play for this. Yeah. King. Once the king gets out of this danger zone, I think black's fine. Nice move by white. Okay, king to e7. White should win this. What's the problem? That's a really bad move. Now the bishop cements the structure. The rook on g7 is trapped. That was a really bad move. King b1 there. Somehow I think black has the advantage. That rook being just completely stuck. Bishop e5, you're threatening the rook on d1. h5, you just take, and bishop. Okay, take the rook. Maybe. Let's see what Hikaru does. So I would take. Trying to keep up. He's calculating something. Let's see what he calculates. It says he's in the think tank. Is he gonna play f5? Can you trap the rook after takes king f8? You have bishop e4 here as well, deflecting the queen. So what is Hikaru going to play? Is he going to take and go rook d8? Is he going to play king f8 afterwards? Rook d8. King f8 as well traps the rook. He goes f5, hitting the rook this way. Rook is completely trapped. And he sacks material. Rook is still trapped. Okay, he takes on f7. But now black gets three pawns on the king side here. Very difficult to attack these pawns. And rook's coming to h2. Hikaru plays rook g8, keeping the rook on the back, and just goes for these passed pawns. He likes to advance his pawns, I noticed, when they're passed. He doesn't really worry too much about advancing them. And in this position, white is having to deal with this passed pawn, which is just overwhelming. The queen's still very powerful, making it very difficult, but the pawn should promote now. And white resigns the game. So this was an opportunity, a really big opportunity for white to win. His technique wasn't there. Speed as well wasn't there. Let's do our last analysis. And make some conclusions. Okay, white changed the opening. In this case, he captured on d5, not what he did previously, and bishop to e4. Up a lot of material. If you can't win up this much material, sorry to say you can't win against Hikaru, especially in this format with 3+0. Takes, knight f3, bishop g5, queen e2, and knight e5. I think this is a fine move. Completely unnecessary to give away the g2 pawn here. You're up so much material. You can castle first, go knight e5, pawn c4, rook d1. Not necessary to go for this, I think. Castles. Takes, d5. And if you're going to play d5 here, you've got to sack the rook and go after these weaknesses. If you don't find this move, which is really difficult to find, I think, then you're really just worse. For example, if you play rook f8, a passive move, queen takes, the evaluation is very much in white's favor and also just very comfortable position for white. This move c4 really complicates the game, but makes sense as well. Rook activates, but it's a much smaller advantage. So white has a huge advantage here. He could have played a little bit slower, pawn c4 and pawn d5. If rook f8, pawn d5 blocks the bishop. If you take, queen g4 comes in, king d8, you could take back, limiting the scope of the bishop. He opened up lines to the king, but then didn't follow up with a sacrifice of the rook. White's still better. I don't see why white's not better. And here, black found a very nice way to trap the rook, which will equalize the material. Black did win that pawn, remember, on g2 as well, and won a pawn on d5. So white's just giving away material to open up lines, but misses the way to proceed here. So one way to proceed maybe is first defend this h4 pawn, and after bishop here, queen here. If bishop g6, you have h5, queen to f3. Just not giving away material is a key here. The rook is completely trapped. Queen f3, rook d8, bishop e5, h5, takes, f5. Really nice, consistent play by Hikaru. Takes, doesn't even take the rook here. Rook is so trapped, he takes back first. Takes, and a slight advantage for black here, but with the pawns rolling down, it's extremely difficult for white to stop the pawns. Takes. Get behind the pawn, start pushing the pawns. He keeps it very simple. He moves the king up, which makes sense here, trying to avoid checks as much as possible. and completely wins the game. So, conclusions. In this game, white plays this setup and white takes on d5 and finds a strong opening tactic. Okay, main reason Hikaru wins is he found a tactical idea to trap white's rook. And yeah, I would say just he had a completely lost position. So he continued to play quickly, kept the pressure on the timer, and at least in some way prevented opening of too many lines to the black king. I think it was more that white lost this game more than black won the game. Main reason for loss is when having a huge advantage in material, white didn't find the best way to avoid material loss and still open up lines to the king. Even if he couldn't find opening lines to the king, he is losing material unnecessarily. Okay, notes. What's interesting is how overall a 2750 rated player can get winning positions against Hikaru, and he played extremely active and looked for pawn sacrifices, let's say pawn breaks, pawn sacrifices, piece sacrifices, but Hikaru's calculation and defensive skills made it extremely difficult, very difficult for white to find a knockout blow. All right, let's pause here for today. I hope you guys enjoyed this live stream, learned some ideas that you can use in your own games, and I'll